Our next speaker is Alex from Caltech, talking about the origins of macroscopic strength in granular material.
Thanks, Jeff. So my name is Alex. I work with Professor Andrade, José Andrade at Caltech in granular materials. And first, let's say that in granular materials, the microscale, what we consider as the microscale, is nothing but the granular scale. It's not the molecular scale, it's not the atomistic scale, but the scale of the grain itself. So having said that, we can begin with it. And the first and big objective is to unravel physical relations between friction angle and contact forces coming from the grain scale and the fabric that is nothing but the topology of the array itself. So we want to connect things that we can measure or see, like stress or strain, to things that we cannot see, which are contact forces, contact interactions, kinematics, and fabric in terms of the rate as depicted by this figure. So, as I mentioned, we want to connect the continuum bore to the granular bore. So, how do we do that? To begin with this bore, we use these two fundamental concepts or equations. So on one hand, we have this spectral decomposition of the co-shear stress, which is well known, pretty well known. And on the other hand, we have this homogenization of the stress tensor, connecting contact forces and this so-called branch vector taking into account the fabric. So this branch vector goes from centroid to centroid between two particles in contact. And we also use these local coordinates in the normal and tangent direction at each point. So using all these tools, we can start doing things like additive decomposition in the sense of volumetric and deviatoric stress. So from this, for arbitrary shaped particles in 2 dimensions, we have that the volumetric part of the stress has some dissipation. So unlike usually considered in most models, like Mohr-Coulomb, Drucker-Prager, and other models, where they blame for the dissipation to the deviatoric part of the stress, we can actually see here, without assuming any model, that we have, in fact, some dissipation coming from the volumetric part of the stress, and of course, some dissipation coming from the deviatoric part of the stress, and not dissipation as well. And we can easily specialize this expression for disks in 2 dimensions, where for that particular case we have no dissipation coming from the volumetric part of the stress, as usually modeled. And then we can also compute the principal stresses and principal directions in terms of contact forces and the fabric. And then extract some explicit analytical theoretical information with our relations from this. And we can also use these expressions as a basis for a multi-scale analytical framework or theoretical framework, where we can compute eigendirections or principal stresses and principal directions for any subdomain inside a given array of particles undergoing loading, and try to relate then this information to the overall behavior of the array. So this provides this theoretical analytical basis for multi-scale frameworks. And now we want to test this kind of framework, and for that we have this numerical test. So first we apply biaxial loading. We load vertically while keeping constant pressure on the walls, the vertical walls. And then we apply shear, as shown here. So this array has around 10,000 particles, polydispersed, meaning that all the particles have different sizes. And we want to study the behavior inside this circular domain. So what's the behavior there? We have these Mohr circles, the first one corresponding to the initial state, the biaxial compression, where we have plotted this polar histogram of the magnitude of the contact forces between the particles. And on top of it, using our equations, we compute the principal directions and principal stresses. And they should align with the polar histogram, and they do in fact. Then we shear the array to the maximum point of rotation, because when we shear the principal directions should rotate. And we plot the polar histogram again. And the principal directions and stresses computed from our equations for that subdomain should align again with the polar histogram, and they do. So now we're kind of more confident about using this framework. We can also do things like computing the shear norms. So as I said before, as I showed before, we have a conservative and dissipative part in the deviatoric stress. And we can compute the total norm of the deviatoric stress, the norm corresponding to the conservational part of the deviatoric stress, and the dissipation. And since we have a very little interparticle friction coefficient of 0.3, we have very low dissipation at this point. Now we want to connect the strength of a given array to the microscale. So we can measure in granular materials the strength using this so-called friction angle. So to do that, we use a well-known model as the Mohr-Coulomb model, the Coulomb envelope. This friction angle, that is a measure of strength in granular materials, is nothing but this slope, the slope of the tangent to a given Mohr circle, and for cohesionless granular materials, this passes through the origin. And then we can relate this angle to the principal stresses. And since we know already the expressions of the principal stresses in terms of contact forces and fabric, we can in fact compute a friction angle for any subdomain for arbitrary shaped particles in two dimensions. But we want to learn more about peak strength, the maximum strength that an array can reach while being loaded. So in order to do that, we consider this biaxial loading, where we keep this horizontal stress constant while increasing monolithically the vertical stress. So something like this happens. We keep one stress constant and we increase the other stress. So these are the Mohr circles. So eventually we reach a peak value, as we have here. And for that peak value, we have derived two necessary and sufficient conditions that we're showing here. So it's the first derivative of the pressure and the first derivative of the maximum shear stress being equal to 0. And now we wonder if we can connect these macroscopic necessary and sufficient conditions for maximum strength to the microscale. So we derive the corresponding expressions for pressure and maximum shear in terms of the microscale. And then we use our conditions. And we get these four expressions in terms of the global axis, the horizontal and vertical components of the forces and branch vectors, and the local coordinates, the normal and tangent components. And by combining these four expressions, we get this result here. So these summations of the components in the global and local frames of reference should be maximum at peak strength. And this means nothing but buckling of the array. So the array is acting just like a column, a confined column, where at peak strength reaches its critical load, and then it buckles and we get some softening. So now we want to test again this framework, this theory, this theoretical framework. And we have a kind of a smaller array. This has like 1,000 particles, around 1,000, polydispersed the same way. And we make it undergo biaxial loading, no shear this time. And the evolution of the friction angle for this array is this. So we reach peak strength around 4.3, 4.4 axial strength in percentage. And we should also, at the same time, have peaks on all those values that I was showing before. So in fact, we reach peak at the same axial strength for all of them, as shown here. And what else can we learn from this framework and from these plots is that as we reach peak strength, we also have maximum dissipation that we can learn from this plot. So peak strength brings maximum dissipation that at the same time means that more contact points are sliding. So many plastic mechanisms are taking place and participating into building pico strength, as we can see here, and learn. So to summarize this very short talk, we have established the micromechanical origin of conservative and dissipative parts of the stress. We also have unraveled explicit connections between grain scale parameters and constitutive parameters as the friction angle. And finally, we've found two necessary and sufficient conditions for maximum strain with corresponding micromechanical counterparts and physical meaning in terms of power. And that would be it for today.